Good morning and good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to today's Exploring by the Seat of Your Pants event. My name is Joe Gorowski, and I'll be your host for today. As always, we love taking these little virtual field trips to Svalbard to meet Hilde and Sunniva. And yeah, so Hilde, Strom and Sunniva Sorby have been in Svalbard for several months now, living in a remote trapper's cabin, Bamsebu. In total, they will spend 9 months there and will become the first women ever to do so on their own, to overwinter what has been a pretty wild winter so far. So along the way, they're taking part in a ton of different citizen science projects, from monitoring ice and the auroras and plastics. And each month, we're lucky enough to connect with them with different experts from around the world for some really cool learning. So before I throw things over to Hilde and Sunniva for a few minutes, I'm going to share a little video because we're able to connect through satellite technology, but we can't get the video. But I want you guys to get a little taste for some of the weather that they're dealing with up there. So just give me a second to do a quick screen share. All right, that's what I want. And let's bring that up and let's hit play here. So there it is, and go. All right, so it might have been a little hard to hear them because the weather is pretty wild up there. The winds are pretty strong, but I'm going to throw things over to Hilde and Sunniva now. And it's so great to have you joining us. And let's get a little update on what the weather's been like the last 24 hours.
Yeah, hi Joe, Sunniva here, and then Hilde will go after. So great that you're doing this for everybody, and so happy that all the kids, all of you on the call right now, thank you. The weather has been wild. We've had some really serious storms up here that have not only made it possible for me to maybe be flown all the way back to Longyearbyen, which is 140 kilometers away, but it ripped the door off a little shed, which has our food in it. And the good thing for us is that it's the ice has come a lot quicker than normal. So we have a whole sea of ice around us right now. It's been really exciting for us because today, January 30th, is the official end of the polar night. And a lot of people probably don't even know what that is. It's for those of you in Canada and the U.S., we don't have a sunrise and a sunset. The sun just goes away for 3 months, and it's starting to come back now. We've been in the dark literally for 3 months, so have had no light, which is why the weather is kind of challenging for us, and also the polar bear danger has been super challenging for us. But we still managed to go out on the ice and put this really long drill into the ice and bring up some samples of the ice for some of our science projects. And here's Hilde for a second.
Yeah, hi everyone. Just 2 days ago, we had a polar bear visiting us. We were inside the hut, and our dog Estra, she barked, and we were out in 2 seconds with our weapons, our headlamps, and there he was, a big polar bear that just came up towards our hut, and Estra was barking, and we were also fire a flare gun, like a firecracker, but he didn't notice anything. He just wandered across just 30 meters away from us, and then off he went. So he wasn't easy to scare, but luckily he wasn't that much interested in us that day. Probably he was here for a week ago, and he torn down one of our barrels with food. So he knows that we have food, but he was not able to get to it, and that's going to be very important for us. The polar bears are not going to find any food around our huts.
All right. Well, I just want to put this into perspective a little more for the students. So you are 140 miles from your nearest neighbor. You're in a small trapper's cabin. You have polar bears coming to visit you in the middle of 24 hours of night. It's quite an amazing adventure and undertaking that you're doing. And I'd love for you to share a little bit about Hearts in the Ice. Why are you spending 9 months in a trapper's cabin in Svalbard?
Well, that's a good question. We don't ever for a second doubt what we is because okay.
All right, boys and girls, we may have to put a pin in that question because it looks like we might be losing our satellite connection. So again, like I said, they're 140 miles from their nearest neighbor. They're in a remote part of the Arctic Circle. So their communication is satellite links, and sometimes it drops out. So hopefully they'll be back in to join us shortly. I'm going to give them about maybe 30 seconds, and then I'm going to introduce Sven, and we might start with a little bit of time with Sven while we see how long it takes him to get the connection dialed back in. But just to put things in perspective, we had a call with them earlier in the month, and you could hear whistling as the wind was ripping through the cabin. So this isn't an especially, strongly built and insulated cabin. So they're cold, they're living in 24 hours of dark right now. So probably a little bit excited to see a little bit of light starting to come back in on the horizon, and they get those polar bear visitors. So pretty amazing. And they're doing some awesome citizen science projects as well. So I don't see them yet. So it might take them a minute or two to dial back in and reconnect the signal. So I am going to change gears here. And we're really excited. This month, our theme is weather. And we are joined by Sven Sundgaard. He is a meteorologist with KARE 11 in Minnesota and an avid runner and world traveler. So Sven, before we get started, I just want to give a quick shout out that we actually have a class joining us, and you are their weather person. So they listen to you all the time. So they're really excited to be joining in live with us today.
Well, I think it must be Cheryl Cater's class.
Potentially on YouTube, but the group that we have with us live on camera is Mrs. Gary's class.
Oh, great. Well,
Yeah.
hello, Mrs. Cater's class. Yeah, we like to complain about cold weather here, as well as probably the students in Canada, but of course it's nothing like what they get in the Arctic. But thanks for having me. I was actually on the mission in September to drop off Hilde and Sunniva in Svalbard, and it was cold enough for most of us then. They had some pretty nasty storms then, but no snow yet. So we got to see what it looks like up there with mainly bare ground, but man, we had some pretty crazy winds. There was one day when we helped load off supplies from the big ship onto the Zodiacs to get to shore. We had some 80, 90 kilometer per hour wind gusts. It was the kind of wind where you could stand backwards and stay upright because the wind was just that strong. So those are the kind of conditions we had to just help send them off. So you can only imagine what some of those similar storms are like in the dead of winter, plus the total darkness. I think that's the thing that would drive most of us crazy. Yes, I'm a meteorologist here in Minneapolis. I have been for 14 years. This is also where I am born and raised in Minnesota. And like many of you probably seen over the course of your lifetime, although students not around as long, been seeing the climate change here and of course around the planet. And one of the interesting things about being in Minnesota or Canada is we are very much connected to the Arctic in terms of our weather and climate. So what happens there doesn't necessarily stay there. And I'm going to explain a little bit about some of those connections that we don't necessarily think about that are kind of opposite of each other, but also kind of update some of the current weather and climate issues that we're seeing in the Arctic right now. So you want me to just take it away and go here?
Yeah, absolutely. Share screen and we'll go from there. Yeah. But I'm with you on those changes. You know, I've been around for a little bit, and our winters up here outside of Toronto just aren't what they used to be. They're a lot warmer, a lot more rain. So I think people are seeing these weather changes all over the world.
Are you seeing my PowerPoint now?
Yep. Yeah, you just have to go full screen.
Okay, let's see, I can do that. All right, how's that?
We,
No?
oh, I want to say we're in business. I saw you click, but it didn't seem to go. Try and give it one more click and see if it comes in for us.
It says it's in full screen. So I don't, oh, I might have to put it in full play mode maybe? Will that do it?
Yeah, just try and hit play from the start and see if that kicks it in.
Okay.
There we go. We got it.
Perfect. So that's just a little intro thing. So another thing I do, because I work in TV, I have the opportunity to, one of my passions is traveling around the world and conservation. You know, because separate from, well, not separate, but it's related to the climate change we're seeing across the planet, is we're also, by many accounts, in a 6th mass extinction. And the first and only one caused by another species. So obviously, as humans, we're changing habitats around the planet, taking over rainforests or other areas for farmland. And then we're also warming the planet at a pace that most species can't keep up with. And that's the key. You'll hear people sometimes say, oh, the planet's always changing, which is true, but rarely does it change this fast. And when it has, it's something like a meteorite that hits the planet. And obviously that didn't end well for the dinosaurs and most things. That was one of a few mass extinction events. So I really like to do stories, bring camera gear around the world and kind of tell some of these stories about what's happening to specific animals and wild spaces around the planet, and how climate is affected by that too, because pretty much everywhere you go in the globe, there is a climate story. So I'm going to talk a little bit about what's going on with climate recently. Maybe you heard, we just finished, of course, 2019, and it was our 2nd warmest year on the planet. And what's interesting, make a little list there of the top 5 warmest years. What do you notice about the top 5 warmest years? Each one of those is the last 5 years. So we know that the planet's getting warmer and warmer and warmer. And yeah, 2016 was a little warmer than 2019, but all of those top 5 are in the last 5 years. And this is kind of stepping back and looking globally for most of last year. And you see a lot of red. You don't have to be a meteorologist or climatologist to see that the planet was warmer than normal. But there are a couple of interesting spots, one of which is where I live in Minnesota. We were one of the few places on the planet that actually had a cooler than normal year. And right in the middle of the continent, and also a couple of spots in parts of Asia that were not as pronounced as it was here. And you know, maybe, I don't know where everybody is there in Canada, but parts of Canada also saw this unusual anomaly of some cooler than normal conditions within the last year. I'm going to talk a little bit more about some of the theories as to why that's happening in some spots as the Arctic is warming so rapidly. So you heard Sunniva and Hilde talk about they're actually ahead of schedule with ice this year. So Svalbard's actually been seeing some pretty normal, or actually even colder than normal conditions, which has become pretty rare for them, especially in the winter. And so don't get too bogged down in this map, but basically it's a similar thing. Look at the reds and the blues. The piece on the right is looking at, you can think of it as sort of averaged conditions for the month of January so far. And if I can, does my arrow show up if I move it around like that? So I'm pointing to Svalbard for all of you there. And what I want you to notice is there's this large blue mass from Greenland through Svalbard and then into parts of northern Norway and northern Russia. And that's actually an area that's been seeing colder than normal conditions lately. So that's why the sea ice is actually ahead of schedule, or at least catching up to normal. Whereas most years, they've been seeing way behind formation of ice and much warmer than normal conditions, especially in the dead of winter like this. And it's important to make these distinctions between weather and climate. Just because they're having a cold month or two right now does not take away from the fact that the Arctic, and especially Svalbard overall, is warming very rapidly. And what's unique about where Sunniva and Hilde are is that Svalbard is one of the fastest changing places on the planet in terms of climate. And it's partly because of its unique position on the globe. If I go back to that map, yeah, you can kind of see, if you follow my arrow here, So we hear a lot about the Gulf Stream, right? And, you know, hurricanes like to follow it. And it's important because the Gulf Stream makes Europe much more inhabitable than it otherwise would be. So it's an ocean current that transports heat from the tropical parts of the Atlantic, and it literally bounces off the east coast of the US. You can think of it kind of bouncing off Virginia, following up towards Newfoundland, and then shooting out towards Greenland, Iceland, the rest of Europe, and Svalbard, and it literally dead ends at Svalbard. And that's important in understanding why Svalbard is changing so much, because you can think of the Gulf Stream as a conveyor belt of heat. And so we know that the oceans are absorbing 90% of the heat that the planet is absorbing right now. So that extra ocean heat is being transported to Svalbard. And the Arctic is already warming at double the rate of the rest of the planet anyway, for several reasons I'm going to explain in a couple of minutes too. But so they're getting even more heat. So that's why Svalbard is warming about 4 times faster than the rest of the planet on average. So they're seeing some of the most rapid changes in terms of glaciers, in terms of sea ice, and anybody who lives there, like Hilde has lived and worked there for many, many years, can tell you that they're seeing those changes firsthand. So this is just another view showing you specifically the temperature changes in the lower part of the atmosphere for January so far, which of course we've almost finished out. And you can see again, a blue spot there just around Svalbard and also Greenland. But if you pay attention to the news this year, Greenland saw rapid melting this summer. So while it might be cold this month, it's overall, bigger picture, a lot warmer. Interesting to note, Hudson Bay also unusually warm here for the month of January. And we've been seeing that in Minnesota specifically. And I imagine Toronto has been probably milder than normal January as well. And ice is really important. Anytime we talk about the Arctic, we're always talking about ice because same thing, well, I had a glass of water with ice in it, but now it's already melted. But the same reason you put ice in your glass, it keeps a drink cool. And ice and water have unique properties in that the temperature of that water won't change until all the ice is melted, really. So having ice around through the year is really important. So we keep track of how much ice is in the Arctic. And what you're seeing here is basically a graph of Arctic sea ice by decade. So the top line in purple, that was Arctic sea ice through the year. This is starting in May when it's at its peak, at the end, or March, April, May. Spring is when the Arctic has its peak ice. You know, the end of the long Arctic winter, you're gonna have the most ice, obviously, and then it melts and reaches a minimum in September. And the important thing to notice here is how these lines keep going down and down. So the purple is the 1980s, the blue, the 90s, the darker blue is the 2000s, and then the orange is the decade that we've been finishing up here, which is the 2010s, and now we're heading, of course, into 2020. And what you notice is each decade there's less and less ice on average, so that there's about a quarter less ice on average in the summer now compared to what there used to be. And so this is showing, this is literally our most recent analysis of the ice in the Arctic right now from 2 days ago. So thanks to satellite technology, we're able to keep a pretty good handle on how much ice and to what extent and what concentration of ice is up in the Arctic. And what you know about salt water is it's really hard to get ice to form, right? That's how cold the Arctic gets in the winter, that you can actually get ice to form in the sea or in the ocean. And it's a different kind of ice than what maybe you're used to, like we are in Minnesota, where lakes freeze. It's not that solid ice. It can be kind of a slushier ice that has more of a texture to it, but that's not necessarily important. But I'm going to zoom in on Svalbard specifically and show you that, again, so the orange line here is where the ice should be at this time of the year, using the 40-year average. But this year we're actually seeing the ice fill in that orange line. So everything in white and that light blue is where the ice is right now, kind of surrounding most of Svalbard. But again, usually that western part of Svalbard stays open because of the Gulf Stream keeping the water a little warmer there. So they're actually seeing pretty normal ice conditions right now, which I've been looking at ice in the Arctic for many years, and it's been a long time since we've seen a normal ice year. So that's good news right now, but it's a little blip. It's one little weather scenario right now in this particular January. And of course, the oceans are warming too. I'm just showing you different graphs that are showing all the same thing, warming temperatures of the water. And this is important because this shows the change in sea ice over time. It basically everywhere is red or orange. That means that all of the Arctic has seen a decrease in ice. Antarctica is a little unique on the other side of the planet, where some areas are seeing less ice, some are seeing more, but all of the Arctic is seeing less ice than normal. And ice is important. Like I said, it keeps the water cold, like you put it in your drink, but it also reflects away the sun's energy. So ice or snow can reflect away up to 85% of the sun's energy. So that keeps the Arctic cold. But when you have open water, when you fly from above or you look at Google Maps satellite view, what do you notice about the oceans? They're a dark blue. It's a dark color. So we know that dark colors absorb more sun than lighter colors. So 93% of open ocean absorbs water. So when we're losing that sea ice and there's less sea ice than normal, that's more heat that's being absorbed by the Arctic. And again, this is just showing the same thing about how when we eliminate that ice and snow, we're changing the way the Arctic warms up. And so that's why the Arctic is warming faster than other parts of the planet, is because the things that keep the Arctic cold are decreasing, that ice specifically, and snow in many ways. And so we call that the albedo, how much sunlight is being reflected or absorbed. And this is just another map showing how much that's changed. So this is showing side by side ice compared to what it used to be and now. And the area in orange and red is areas of the ocean on average now that are open in the summer and absorbing sun instead of reflecting it away. So we're seeing this old ice, we call it multi-year ice, because it's normally so cold in the Arctic that there's ice there year round if you go up near the North Pole. But that area of ice that stays year round is shrinking rapidly. And that tells you a bigger picture. That tells you that there's a long-term warming, not just one warm summer or two warm summers, but that to melt that ice that's several years old in some cases, something bigger is going on. There's a long-term warming throughout the year. So this is looking at ice in the fall of 1985. So again, towards the end of the Arctic summer, this is where you would have to go to find ice. Now, Svalbard, by the end of the summer, usually doesn't have much sea ice around it. So you got to go a little further north towards the North Pole. But watch what happens. We go from 1985 to the year 2000. We see it shrink. And then really even more dramatically from the year 2000 to 2015, that multi-year ice really shrinks. So what you want to pay attention to is the darker blue and whites. Those are the older ice. So we're seeing ice stay through the year sometimes now, but it's much smaller and it's a newer ice. It's a fresher ice. And that is important because that's going to melt quicker than ice that's thicker and a bit older. So I did talk about how the Arctic can affect our weather. So there's an area of research right now called cold or warm Arctic, cold continents. So we're literally screwing up the jet streams. The jet stream is a wind that is flowing aloft 30,000 feet up. So if you're in an airplane, that's how high up these winds are. And because we're warming the Arctic quicker, that's weakening that wind, and that's allowing air from the Arctic to go further south. So you've probably, at least here in the US, we talked about these polar vortex winters we've had a couple of, where we're getting this unusually cold air south. And some people say, oh, see, no global warming. Well, no, that's air that's supposed to be in the Arctic, and it's warmer than normal for the Arctic, but warmer than normal Arctic air over Minnesota or Canada is going to be pretty cold still. And then that swings the jet stream up. In this case, you can see all the way up to Greenland or Svalbard or Iceland. So there have been a couple times in the last few years where it's been above freezing way up into the Arctic, way up into the North Pole in the dead of winter, when they're getting no sunlight right now. It should not reach, 5 degrees Celsius in January or February, but that's been happening more and more at the North Pole. So again, this is just another view. This is a good side-by-side view of showing you ice in March 1985 compared to March 2018. And the biggest takeaway there is there's a lot less ice that's staying year-round. And then this is just showing how temperatures have changed in the Arctic over several 100 years to even a couple of thousand years, because we're able to do sort of proxy temperatures where we can estimate the temperatures from ice core samples, literally sampling bubbles of air that are trapped in really old ice and glaciers, and we can derive what the climate used to look like. And it's just really rapidly warming right now. And this is showing why we know carbon dioxide, one of the bigger greenhouse gases, And that's a gas that specifically we're adding to the atmosphere through our burning of fossil fuels. And again, we know that carbon dioxide levels have not been this high in a very, very long time in Earth's history. So here's actually specifically a picture from Svalbard. And when you go there, you see these incredible glaciers, but then you look at the glacial moraines, which are these gray areas. So this is where ice used to be. If you can kind of see that, so that dark areas that have kind of a green, it's sort of moss and lichens that are growing because there wasn't ice there, compared to the gray bare rock and dirt. That's where there used to be ice. So these are all changes in these glaciers in the course of just really 20, 30 years. So this is, I just kind of filled this in rudimentarily, but you can see where this ice would have been, say, 30, 40 years ago. So I think that's kind of a good summary and probably a lot to digest, but I wanted to give you just an overview about what's happening this year in the Arctic, specifically in Svalbard, and then again, what we're seeing in terms of the longer term.
Yeah, absolutely, Sven. Thank you so much for sharing that with us, and especially up-to-date data like that. That's awesome. And I mean, it's hard to look at all of that and not, come to the conclusion that we've changed things. It's not for the better, and it's continuing to do so. And I bet, most students, maybe some of the younger students might not have noticed yet, but I bet if you talk to your parents, they would say that things have been a little different. The climate just isn't what it used to be. So thanks so much for sharing that with us. Great data, great graphs. And I've been watching Hilde and Sunniva kind of pop back in and pop back out. So the next time they pop back in, we are going to grab them, finish that question, and then fire some questions at them. But for now, let's start meeting some of our classrooms. And I should give a shout out to YouTube. So we have a lot of classrooms who are starting to tune in live on YouTube with us. A few of them have introduced themselves already. So if you haven't introduced yourself, send a message in the chat sidebar. Looks like so far Miss Coleman's class in Virginia Beach. We've got Miss Campbell's class in Kitchener, Ontario, and a few other ones there. So introduce yourselves in the chat sidebar and send me in a question or two. And now let's go to our live classroom. So if you guys have a question specifically for Sven, give me a big wave in your classroom and I'll go to your classroom first. And we'll do a few questions for him before we do a few for Hilde and Sunniva. So Mrs. Robinson's class is waving like crazy. So I think I better go there first. They are joining us, let's see, from Pembroke here in Ontario, Canada, grade 5, 6s. Let's fire that microphone up for them. There it is. How are we doing, Pembroke?
Good.
All right, who's got a question?
Nice and loud.
How do you think about climate change and how do we have an effect on it?
Yeah, so we know that the planet is warming, and human effect was I was talking about carbon dioxide emissions. So anytime we burn a fossil fuel, so oil or gas or coal, that releases carbon dioxide into the air. Anytime you burn anything, one of the results is carbon dioxide. And so that is a pretty potent greenhouse gas. There's also methane, which is even more potent greenhouse gas, but there's smaller amounts of it in the atmosphere, but we're actually seeing it increase because of agricultural production. So farming can release methane. But another interesting thing about methane release and carbon dioxide emissions is when we're warming up the Arctic, there's parts of the Arctic, like in Svalbard, where Hilde and Sunniva are, that stay frozen. The ground stays frozen year round because the summer in the Arctic is very short and not very warm. And so what happens is when we warm up the Arctic more and more for longer periods of time, we're seeing that permafrost, we call it, permanent frost, thaw out, and that's releasing more carbon and methane into the atmosphere. So it's kind of this runaway effect where we're adding greenhouse gases to the atmosphere to warm it up, but then there's additional greenhouse gases being released because we're thawing out areas that are supposed to stay frozen, and that's releasing even more. So that's another thing that we're seeing, particularly in Siberia and northern Canada, large methane stores that are frozen. And when we thaw that out, we're just adding to it. And methane is even more potent, as I mentioned, than carbon dioxide.
All right, and it looks like Hilde and Sunniva are back in with us. Can you hear me?
Yeah, we're here. Sorry, bad satellite communication today, but we're here.
That's okay. While we have you, we want to make sure we get a couple questions in.
Perfect.
Okay.
Go for it.
If any classrooms have a question specifically about overwintering in Svalbard and the work that they're doing and the weather and such, let's get a big wave now and let's see if we can work in a few of those questions. Okay, I see a class already waving like crazy. Good stuff. We are going to go to Alameda. We've got Mrs. Audie Kane's group joining us. They are 6th graders. Let's get that microphone turned on. How are we doing, 6th graders?
Hi.
Hello.
Neil, go ask the question.
All right, fire away. We're ready for you, bud.
Hi, my name is Neil. I am a very interesting person.
Neil, they're waiting.
still
You have to
thinking.
ask the question.
All right, who's got a question?
Okay, so
You guys.
Something about living up in the Arctic, about polar bears, about
What they're eating, something like that. Ask about other animals they're seeing.
what other animals have you seen other than the polar bears?
We have seen a lot of reindeers. They are like our neighbors. They are around our hut. So I guess we've seen maybe a herd of 20 reindeers. And then we see quite a few polar foxes. And during winter, they are completely white, like very small polar bears, running around looking for food. And they also store food from last summer, so they dig up the food from the summer. And then we see some birds. And until the ice came this autumn, we saw a lot of whales, small belugas. They are white whales. So those are the animals that we see around here.
All right. Well, let's keep moving. Let's go to Mrs. Cousins' group. They are in Montreal, Quebec, joining us today. Let me get their microphone turned on. How are we doing, Quebec?
Sunniva, we'd like to know how you're dealing with the extreme temperature. What is the extreme temperature you've been living in recently? And what are the extents you have to go to keep warm?
Hi, Sharon and my alumni high school at Trafalgar. Hey, it's been the coldest here has been about -34. I know there's big winds.
All right, that's not promising. So she was just saying the coldest they've had so far is -34. But I think, by the way, they just kind of died out. We're going to lose them. So we'll continue with that shortly. Let's continue moving on to classrooms. Oh, we've got some crazy waving. Mrs. Nagy's class there in Milton. Let's get that microphone turned on. How you doing, Milton? All right, come on up. Nice and loud.
Did you guys bring a lot of food or did they have to find all the food?
All right, we're gonna have to put a pin in that question for now, but I can answer that for them before they come back because we've done a few events together. And what they have up there, they brought their food with them. You heard them talking a little bit about the barrels that they have to put the food in to keep the polar bears out of the food. They've had visitors. Sounds like a visitor the last week or so has been coming, maybe the second time to come and visit the shed to see if it can get any food out of those barrels. So pretty much what they have, they brought up there with them. We can ask if they're doing a little bit of fishing, but I think that they have pretty much everything up there with them for the whole time that they're up there. And Sven, you might know a little bit about that too, since you dropped them off.
Yeah, I was actually trying to find some pictures and things because, yeah, we unloaded many barrels of food and things like fresh water that you don't necessarily think of. Many barrels of fresh water we had to to haul off the boat and empty. And it was quite a process because they literally needed everything that they would need for 9 months there. One barrel was full of like potato chips, and one barrel was full, I mean, everything. And they just have this little kitchen there in this little space. I don't know if you guys have seen pictures or video of where they're at, but it's a very small area. And so there's a lot of storage outside of the cabin, as you heard them mentioning. And so hopefully they get that door back on or something, because you don't want the bear to get the food.
Yeah. All right. I know where we should go next. Let us go to Mrs. Gary's group. So they're hanging out with us in Woodbury, Minnesota. So let me get their microphone turned on. Where is it? There it is. How we doing, Minnesota?
Good. How do you handle the darkness? Do you just want to sleep?
All right. So again, we're going to have to put a little pin in that one because Hilde and Sunniva have ducked out on us. Unfortunately, the satellite signal's not cooperating. So we'll make sure that we get that one in next. But let's see if any classrooms have questions for Sven. And let's work in a couple of those ones before they come back to us. There we go. I see a group we can jump to start. We'll come back to Mrs. Gary's group, I promise. Let's see, Mrs. Prozenko's group, 3rd and 4th graders in Lindsay. Let me get your microphone turned on. How we doing, Lindsay?
Hi.
Wait 1 second.
Okay. There we go.
Who or what organizations have been helping stop global warming?
That's a good question. There's a lot of organizations involved and a lot of countries involved too. So a lot of different countries are trying to band together to sort of hold each other accountable and make some goals about cutting carbon dioxide emissions by a certain amount by a certain year. And yeah, multiple different, I mean, you could list off a lot of different organizations, but it really is going to combat a global problem like global warming. It's going to require the whole globe to do it. So we know that those of us in North America, Europe, Australia are some of the biggest carbon emitters. So we kind of have to lead the way on it.
All right. And so I think Hilde and Sunniva are back in the call with us. They did send me a message that -34 inside the hut and it's not insulated. So they have a wood burning stove that they use to keep warm. And while you were away, Hilde and Sunniva, if you can hear me, we had another question from a class in Minnesota, and they were wondering, how do you deal with polar night? Do you just sleep all the time? What do you do?
Well, just to finish the question before, and I just want to thank Sharon and team at TRAF. It's not insulated inside here, so we have had freezing temperatures, so we have to keep a really positive attitude about all that. As far as the polar night, I'm taking vitamin D, and so is Hilde, but I get really, really sleepy because the only light we have is from either a candle or artificial light. So we stay with a really a good routine. We train, we work out every day, we do yoga, we train with resistance band, we walk every day, we make sure we stay active because it would be really super easy to sleep for 3 months.
All right, another classroom that we haven't visited yet. If you have a question for Hilde and Sunniva, in fact, let's visit Mrs. Franz's group because I know that we definitely haven't been there yet. So Mrs. Franz's group is joining us. There we go, from Red Deer, Alberta, some 5th graders. Let's get that microphone turned on. How we doing, Alberta?
Cool.
Uh-oh, maybe their microphone's not cooperating. Mrs. Franz, if you can still hear and see me, send me a message in the chat sidebar. I'll make sure that I work it in for your classroom. So sorry that we can't hear you right now. Oh man, lots of questions on YouTube. We've got classrooms in New Jersey. We've got classrooms, looks like Illinois. Okay, very cool. Virginia, lots of classrooms hanging out with us right now. So let's go, Sven, this might be a good one for you that came up. They're wondering, throughout the last 20 years, Oh, that might be a tough question to ask. Oh, here we go. Here's one for Hilde and Sunniva from Mrs. Breckenfield's group in California. So they're wondering about your thermals. Are you wearing thermals all the time, Hilde and Sunniva?
Yes, we are. We are wearing long underwear 24/7, which is, I can't wait to be on a beach somewhere, or I won't say all these things out loud, but it's quite an experience to be covered up all the time. But we have to be. We sleep sometimes with a small hat to keep our head warm, and we absolutely sleep with long underwear every night. Want to say something?
All right. Let's turn it over now. We visited every classroom live, which is awesome. Mrs. Fran's group, if you can still hear and see me, make sure you send a question via the chat and I'll make sure I work it in. But we've got a couple more minutes. So give me a wave in your classroom if you want to come back for another, of course, every classroom. So let's start with Mrs. Robinson's group. Let's see how many questions we can get through in the next couple of minutes.
Nice and loud, Sonia.
This is for Sven.
Come closer, honey.
Nice and loud for us.
Yeah, she's coming.
This is for Sven. When did scientists realize ice melting was at a critical state?
I think it's something we've really noticed in the 80s and 90s, particularly. So we didn't have really good ice records until we've had good satellite data. So you'll see a lot of times when we're showing charts and looking at ice in the Arctic, we go to basically 1970, so 50 years ago. That's when we really started to get good satellite data. And so that's something that's helping us really understand the climate more, and how ice is changing are some of these better and better high-tech satellites. So NASA's launched some new satellites just in the last couple of years that can do some really crazy stuff, not just give us pictures of ice, which is helpful, but also we can tell how fast ice is moving, and they can measure the Greenland ice sheet to like a millimeter and track how many millimeters per month ice is moving. And so that's how we've learned some things in terms of these, we've learned that glaciers can accelerate, and we call them surge glaciers, where they sort of, the water melts underneath it, and then you can imagine like a luge, the ice accelerates on that water on top of land and ice. And we've learned that through satellites that have been able to measure these fast movements of ice that you wouldn't be able to see necessarily. So really the last 20 years is when we've seen some really crazy changes in ice, but we've been observing it well for 50 years and seen this decline basically since the 1980. The last 40 years is when we've been seeing pretty much a steady decline in Arctic ice.
Yeah, and I really like that you brought up that point about the meltwater underneath kind of speeding up the ice. It really is a feedback system where when things start to change, it starts to accelerate. And even if we were just to turn off all, greenhouse gas emissions, it would still be a long time before, we saw any noticeable, I think, kind of turn back to normal. So it's a system that just keeps going, and the more it warms, the more there's consequences. So Mrs. Gary's group in Minnesota, do you guys have another question? I popped your microphone on. Here, someone.
Is it positive? Yeah, is it positive for the climate when the ice comes in early?
It's good for the climate, and it's good for animals like the polar bear. You heard them talk about the polar bears, and everybody's fascinated by polar bears because they depend on that sea ice. So yeah, so if you're a polar bear in Svalbard right now, where they are, you're having a good winter. But one good winter out of 10 years that have been bad ones aren't going to be good for your long-term health. And I was actually there was just a new study that came out on polar bears specifically in one part of the Arctic, Baffin Bay. So that's between Canada and Greenland, and it's kind of confirming things that we've known about what could happen to polar bears, where they're spending up to a month more on land. And a polar bear should be in the water on ice, that's where they actually spend most of their life because they hunt seals. That's their main food source. And they can only hunt a seal on sea ice because in the water, the seal's going to be faster. And on land, well, the seal's not going to be on land. They're going to be on the shore maybe, and they're going to be in the water pretty quick. So the more time a polar bear spends on land, the less they're eating. And so we're seeing polar bears' body condition change. So they're getting skinnier, and mother polar bears are having fewer babies because a polar bear mother will have 2 or 3 cubs in a litter, and they're having fewer of those. They're having maybe only 1 or 2 because they're not able to provide enough food or energy to support both or 3.
All right. So if I Hilde and Sunniva back, I'm going to squeeze in one more question. We'll go to Mrs. Nay's class. Your microphone is on.
Hi, this is for Sven. What can we do at home to slow the ice from melting?
So what we can do is indirectly is all try to think more about what we're doing in terms of our energy needs. You know, and we've made some progress in terms of using less coal. Coal is a very dirty carbon emitter. So a lot of, I'm sure in Canada, it's the same as the US. There's been a pretty big switch to natural gas, which is much cleaner and has lower carbon emissions. But also in terms of electricity, solar power, trying to use more renewable energy. I mean, the sun is free, it's there. And even in cold places like Canada or Minnesota, we get a lot of energy from the sun that's just there for us to use. And so we've been seeing a lot of places move towards solar energy, but we need to do more of that and try to just think more about, do we need to drive to all these places as much, or, you know, and put a lot of pressure on our governments and our corporations, because it's a lot of the emissions are coming from big industries, and you know, governments and countries working together can play a big role in reducing those emissions. Because like Joe said, we're not going to just turn off this system overnight. The planet is going to be warmer for a long time. We're not going to go back to what it was 50 years ago. But what we can do is prevent these worsening scenarios from happening. So you've probably seen what's been happening in Australia. Well, this year, what happened there is that's weather. It's one particularly bad year, and what's become a worse and worse fire season there. But that could be the new normal if we allow the planet to warm to, we think about 3 degrees Celsius, and we're approaching 1.5 degrees. So if we continue on that track, that could be every year in Australia, for one example.
All right. Well, Hilde and Sunniva, I can see that you're with us again. Do you guys want to jump in with a final word from Svalbard?
Yeah, yes. I don't know if you mentioned it, Sven, but ice is also very important for the life in the ocean. We've not just drilled a hole in the ice, and there are so much going on underneath the ice that's sort of the food base for the rest of the ocean. And also on the top of the ice, we have the seals giving birth to the newborn seals, and that's very important for the polar bears. But what we do see also, since I've been here now for 25 years up on Svalbard, and I've seen the huge changes that Sven just talked about in the temperature, and I haven't seen this much ice in many years as we have just now. But the polar bears seems also to adapt. So maybe that's a little positive sign. Maybe we are able to keep the polar bears on this planet because now me and Sunniva have seen the polar bear hunting reindeers on land. So, but we all need to make a difference. We all need to be thoughtful users and think about energy, as Sven just told you about, and everything we do. Me and Sunniva here, regarding the energy, we have solar panel and windmill. So you all matters, all of you.
Just one word from me, and it speaks to the question, if you're still there, Joe, that someone asked about why we're doing this. I think you asked. We are polar pioneers. We're going to be up here for 9 months in the middle of nowhere collecting data for scientists that really want to engage, you know, all of you on the phone call and everyone around the world to understand what in the world is going on and how to not be so depressed about it, but actually how to how to be inspired by the fact that we live in this amazing world, and we need to actually wrap our arms around her and love her up and protect her and understand her and get out there and do something about it. So I just want to thank every single one of you on the call today. And we're up here doing what we're doing, and we know there's a lot of voices out there. So we just want to keep the conversation going.
All right. Well, on that note, I want to say a huge thank you to all our classrooms who tune in via YouTube. A huge thank you to all our classrooms who are joining us live on camera right now. Thank you for the awesome questions. Sven, thank you for joining us today, being our guest, and thank you for, just some great data summarized in a really easy to understand way. So thank you so much for that today. And Hilde and Sunniva, thank you for what you're doing, not only spending the winter 9 months in Svalbard, but being so engaged and active in citizen science, as well as getting the word out to classrooms and trying to inspire them. So thank you so much for joining us today. Okay, and that sound means that the satellite's about to go. So again, I want to give a huge shout out to everybody today. Today was great. I'm going to turn the microphones on, boys and girls. If you want to get really loud, big goodbye and thank you. Let's do that. And so here we go. All the microphones are coming on. Boys and girls, nice and loud. All right. Don't forget to follow along to get some updates from Hilde and Sunniva. We're obviously going to have more events as the months go on with more experts, more scientists, more explorers. So we hope to see more of your classrooms tuning in with us. But for now, I am going to sign us off. Sven, again, thank you so much for spending some time with us today.
You bet. Thank you.